Welcome to another of the podcasts from Bracebridge Public Library. I'm Patrick Boyer in Bracebridge, and for this podcast, we're going to draw, and some other ones that are going to follow, we're going to draw from stories that are in my book, Muskokans Fight the Great War. We're recording this in the autumn of 2020, at a time when we're, of course, coming to think of Remembrance Day on November 11th. And a lot of the stories that are in this book that will be featured in this and subsequent podcasts really set the context for why there would even be a Remembrance Day. The facts that led to the creation of a war over which no Muskokan had any influence, but which inevitably they had to respond to. Our ancestors were part of the British Empire, and in foreign policy, we were definitely a colonial power. Our foreign policy was set in London, not in Ottawa. And so we were automatically engaged in the First World War once Britain decided to go to war. So this first podcast in the series is really looking at that context, that global context of imperial powers, and where Canada and Muskoka fitted in. Now, the First World War was a global war, not the first, because the 7 Years' War back in the 1700s was indeed a worldwide war of imperial powers, which in North America took primarily a battlefield between the French Empire and the British Empire. But by 1914, the World War was between 8 different empires: the British, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the French, the Ottoman, the Russian, and the Japanese. Our focus as Muskokans and as part of the British Empire was pretty much on the battle in Europe, and indeed just the Western Front, the northern portion of the Western Front in France and a little bit of Belgium. So why did this war erupt? Well, that's what we're going to look at, because with the power of the British Empire having reached its zenith by that time under Queen Victoria, there was a sense of invincibility. The British Royal Navy ruled the oceans, and the red on the world map denoting the British Empire, a red map, by the way, that was created by a Canadian, John Parkin, showed more land than any other empire had. So it was a kind of a confident, even a smug sense of power that led the British to believe that should they challenge Kaiser Wilhelm, who was increasingly aggressive in his foreign policy, the Germans were a bit late getting into the game of having overseas empires. He was trying to make up for lost time and picking up land where he could in Africa and in the remnants of the Ottoman Empire through the Middle East and further east. The British felt that it was time to challenge Kaiser Wilhelm and his allies, and they went to war. Now, the irony is that there were 3 those powers who had signed the Triple Entente, and 3 other of those European powers who had signed the Triple Alliance. And those were defensive treaties meant to ensure that there never would be a war breakout. However, the irony in it was that once the Germans began to take certain action and did not back down, it triggered the other alliance into defense, and the action was over the German invasion of Belgium. So Canada was immediately at war in August 1914. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that imperial sense within our country, but first understanding that these wars between empires were actually family feuds. Royalty did not confine itself to national boundaries. Kaiser Wilhelm was the firstborn grandson of Queen Victoria. The King George, who was monarch of not only Britain, but of course the British Empire, including Canada, was the first cousin of Kaiser, or King, Wilhelm, of Russia, the Kaiser of Russia. And so Nicholas, Tsar Nicholas. They were cousins, all of them. And they would get together. I'm looking, I can show these pictures from the book that just document this a little bit. First of all, here I will step back a slight degree. This is the town of Bracebridge in 1914. And you can see, apart from all the automobiles, the early automobiles, the Union Jacks that are draped across the street and all the bunting. This was set up for the welcoming of the Minister of War, Sam Hughes, to the town of Bracebridge, just on the eve of war when he was here to rally Muskokans for battle. This shows the front pages of the Globe newspaper, which from Toronto circulated widely in the district. Great Britain and Germany are now at war. And from the Daily Colonist newspaper in Victoria, BC, very typical of the pro-British mindset across Canada where it existed, and that was certainly in the district of Muskoka. It's all showing from the King and the dreadnought battleships and all the headlines and Canadians ready to fight. All of this was ramping up the war spirit for empire. Here we have a picture of our Prime Minister of the day, Robert Borden, Sir Robert Borden, and beside him, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the recent Prime Minister who Borden had defeated and was now leading the official opposition in Parliament. Well, they were rivals on many major issues, but here with the war overseas, they united, and Laurier was actually more outspoken and more eloquent than Borden in speaking about the way that Canada would respond, heart and mind, to the needs of the British Empire in time of war. Indeed, there's a picture of Laurier speaking at a big rally that you can see here in Montreal. Those thousands of people turning out were there to support the British Empire, unity across the country. And at the time, hard for us to think of now when we have a monarch who is very limited in powers, that at that time, and here is the Governor General, His Royal Highness the Duke of Connaught. He was a field marshal in the British military forces. He was a member of the royal family, and he was Governor General of Canada. And as such, he took a very strong hand in the conduct of the war in Canada. He went to Valcartier to see off the Canadian troops and give a big speech. He operated continuously from an office in the East Block of the Parliament buildings on Parliament Hill. He met with all kinds of officials and had his hands definitely in the conduct of Canadian war effort and foreign policy. And his daughter, Princess Patricia, seen here presenting her colors, the flag, to a new Canadian regiment, that became the famous Princess Pats, the Canadian Princess Patricia Infantry. All of these were indications of how, just over a century ago, Canada was very much part of the British Empire. I'm showing you as well this picture of a soldier who enlisted from Huntsville. He was one of the Bernardo boys. Those were the children from orphanages in Britain who came to Canada, and that program began basically in the 1870s, coinciding with when Muskoka was being settled, and these children were sent out to work on farms in Canada. North Muskoka had the highest per capita representation of home children, Bernardo boys, of any place in Canada. When the war came along, they enlisted almost as if they'd never left home. It was a way of vindicating themselves and showing that they were still British, even though they'd had a very rough time in the country that they were shipped away from. And they went back to fight for the king, fight for the country, and show that they were true Brits. That's an important fact for something we're going to come to in a minute. So that kind of gives an overview of how, at the time, these people that you see in this picture, all the monarchs of different British of the British Empire and all the other monarchs across Europe got together. It was a transnational affiliation between the royal families. We think today of multinational corporations. We have a better name for it, transnational corporations, because they're operating above the boundaries of individual countries. Well, this was the royalty of at the turn of the 20th century in Europe. And it wasn't just the kings, the monarchs. It was all the nobles and people, of royal blood who held great positions, including who was our Governor General, who were part of this extended family compact. And so the sentiment as the war progressed among people was that, I'm not fighting for my country, I'm fighting for the king. Yeah, but they're all fighting a family feud. It really was that kind of division developing in the world. And you see in Russia, there was, that led to the revolution that overthrew the Tsar. There are all of these things that were happening because of imperial sentiment, and Muskokans had zero say in the matter. We were enlisting in numbers. We created a huge fighting force and a viable operation on the home front as well to support the war. The final thing to say about this imperial sentiment is that being so pro-British, there was a lingering sentiment against French-speaking people. And the fact that within Canada, French-speaking people and English-speaking people were enlisting in the same ratios. And the War Minister, Sam Hughes, who was a devout Orangeman, which was basically very pro-Protestant and anti-Catholic, and they controlled politics throughout this province, in this district, and nationally. He was very strongly against the French and was giving out a bigoted anti-French view as Canada's war minister, that the French were slackers. They were not pulling their weight, and only 4% were enlisting, which was, talk about fake news in 2020, that was fake news in 1914, 15, and 16. But it was believed, and including in places like Muskoka, that the French were not participating the way they should be in the war. The actual research more recently done, and this is why we call this a modern history of Muskoka, because we have to infuse the stories of the past with better research that has come along later as a result of good disciplined scholarship, shows that in fact French Canadians born in Canada were enlisting in the same ratio as English-speaking Canadians born in Canada. The apparent blip were all the Brits who had come out in those waves of immigration into Canada preceding World War I, who automatically felt the call to duty and enlisted and went to fight, which distorted the number very dramatically and was played on by all the Orangemen and others who were against the French. And ever since right to the present day, we have had this false division in Canadian society of national unity because of attitudes among the Anglo communities against the French, born out of fear and resentment and antipathy in the War of Worlds and Empires in 1914, 1918. So all of these are, of course, expanded on in a lot more detail in the book, but I wanted at this time to be able to, through the services offered by our great public library system and the series of podcasts from Bracebridge Public Library, to share those views with you about the context which gave rise to the Great War in 1914, 1918. Thanks for watching. I'm Patrick Boyer, speaking to you from Bracebridge.